Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a tough but really crucial subject, the nature and, well, the roots of harmful actions. Now, when we think about why bad things happen, our minds often go straight to ideas of right and wrong, maybe even, religious explanations.
Sure, that's common.
But in this deep dive, we're going to explore a potentially surprising angle. We're drawing insights from historical events and psychological research, and we'll be focusing particularly on the book Political Ponerology.
Right.
We want to give you, the listener, a kind of fresh way of looking at a problem that's, well, it's been with humanity for a very long time.
Exactly. And while, philosophical and theological discussions definitely have their place, what we want to do for you today is take a more analytical, almost observational approach.
Okay.
We'll be looking at patterns in history, kind of alongside findings from psychology, to better understand the human elements that lead to really harmful actions and societal problems.
Right.
Think of it as connecting the dots between what we see happening and maybe some of the deeper underlying causes.
And for this exploration, we're not just relying on this one book, are we?
No, not at all.
We're looking at a range of sources, historical accounts, conflicts and cruelty throughout the ages, psychological studies, and political ponerology kind of acts as a central framework to help us make sense of it all.
That's the idea.
Our goal here is really to extract key insights that can give you those aha moments, but without overwhelming you with too much detail. So let's just jump right in.
Let's do it. So when we talk about evil, many people immediately think of those traditional religious concepts. Augustine, for instance, famously distinguished between moral evil, the bad things humans do intentionally,
Right.
and natural evil, like earthquakes or disease. That's been a dominant way of understanding it for centuries.
Right, that's the framework many of us are familiar with. But as we mentioned, the perspective we're taking here, which is heavily influenced by political ponerology, it shifts the focus a bit.
Yep.
Instead of primarily looking at theological explanations for why bad things happen, we're going to be examining the human contribution, the sort of psychological factors involved in generating harm.
And what's fascinating and frankly quite disturbing when you look back at history is just the sheer pervasiveness of suffering and cruelty across different eras, different cultures.
Yeah.
The book really highlights this, from ancient tribes engaged in brutal raids through barbarian invasions, the seemingly endless conflicts of the Crusades, the cold efficiency of the Inquisition, right up to the horrors of modern genocides and wars. History, well, in its various disciplines, unfortunately provides ample documentation of this. It's not pretty.
And the book suggests that what might set apart the individuals responsible for a lot of this widespread harm isn't necessarily a conscious decision to choose wrong in a traditional moral sense,
Right.
but something perhaps more fundamental about their psychological makeup.
Which brings us to a really central and, perhaps unsettling idea from the book, this concept of an utterly empty hole in the psyche.
That sounds quite profound. Can you elaborate on what that actually entails?
Well, think of it as a core deficiency in certain individuals. It's a lack of those inherent humanizing qualities that most of us possess, or at least possess to a greater degree.
Okay.
It's like a missing piece in their emotional and psychological makeup of void, where things like empathy, genuine remorse, and a basic understanding of the value of others should be, but, well, they just aren't there.
And this isn't a completely new idea, is it? The book seems to draw on earlier research in psychopathy by people like Robert Hare, Herbie Clem.
Even Bill Craig,
How did their work start pointing towards this idea of a fundamental deficit?
Well, these researchers were among the first to really dig deep into what we now call psychopathy, and their early observations suggested that there's a notable segment of the population who inflict significant harm on others, within families, among acquaintances, even towards strangers, but without necessarily engaging in overt criminal acts that lead to arrest and conviction.
Right. So not your typical violent offenders that end up in prison necessarily.
Exactly. But still causing considerable damage, emotionally, financially, socially.
Right.
And Cleckley, in particular, made a key observation. Psychopathy appeared to be relatively common, even among individuals who seem to function quite well in society on the surface.
Really?
Yeah, he found examples in various professions, business, medicine, even within the field of psychiatry itself.
Wow. That really challenges our easy assumptions about who is capable of causing harm, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
And this idea that psychopathy exists on a spectrum is important here too, right? The book touches on criminal psychopathy, often called antisocial personality disorder. How does that relate to this core concept of an empty hole?
While some contemporary researchers view what we call criminal psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder as sort of an extreme manifestation of a particular personality type.
Okay.
Interestingly, the book offers a slightly different way to think about it. It suggests we might consider these individuals as unsuccessful psychopaths.
Unsuccessful, meaning,
Meaning those whose lack of internal restraints, or maybe just their circumstances, lead them to engage in more obvious criminal behavior and, crucially, get caught.
I see. So the underlying issue might be similar, but the outcome in terms of getting caught is different.
That's one way the book frames it, yeah.
Okay, so we're starting to get a sense of this fundamental lack, this empty hole in certain individuals. Now, the author of Political Ponerology, they faced some pretty significant challenges in trying to share these ideas, didn't they? It sounds like quite a difficult journey.
Oh, indeed. Writing this book was apparently a decades-long project, and as the author notes in later editions, the insights it contains have only become, in their view, more relevant over time. However, the path to getting this information out into the world was far from smooth.
The author mentions being labeled as having dangerous science. That sounds, well, it sounds more like something out of a Cold War thriller than academic research.
It does, doesn't it? But the author recounts facing considerable opposition. This included, apparently, being identified in Austria by someone who was later revealed to be an agent of communist secret services.
Wow.
According to the preface, there were even coordinated efforts involving covert networks in the U.S. aimed at hindering the book's publication and its widespread availability.
That's a pretty serious claim. Resistance from intelligence agencies. What was the rationale behind that, according to the author?
Well, the author suggests that these networks and individuals within them, some knowingly, some perhaps unknowingly, saw the book's analysis as a kind of threat to their ideological agendas.
Okay.
And this alleged resistance apparently manifested in professional difficulties for the author, denial of support, and even a period of having to take on manual labor at an advanced age, which negatively impacted their health.
Goodness. And there's a really telling story in the book about a change in professors that kind of illustrates how these potentially flawed perspectives can infiltrate even academic institutions. Can you share that?
Yes, that anecdote is quite revealing, I think. It describes a new professor who, while maybe charismatic, seemed to lack deep scientific understanding, but presented sort of naive ideas as absolute truths, while also showing disdain for the students. It really highlights how critical thinking can be undermined and how less rigorous perspectives can sometimes gain prominence, even in places supposedly dedicated to learning and intellectual development.
This idea of individuals concealing their true intentions, whether for survival or personal gain, seems to be a recurring theme. The author shares a personal story about his uncle surviving the Soviet Revolution by skillfully pretending allegiance to different ideologies. That's a powerful image.
It is a very vivid illustration, yeah.
Yeah.
The uncle's ability to quickly assess the dominant ideology of any armed group he encountered during the revolution, whether they were white or red,
Right.
and then convincingly feign loyalty to that ideology just to stay alive, is a stark example of how individuals can mask their true beliefs when their very survival is on the line. He became, in essence, a master of ideological camouflage.
And how does this personal story connect with the broader themes explored in the book?
Well, it serves as an early illustration of a key concept, that individuals are capable of skillfully concealing their true nature and intentions.
Okay.
While the uncle's motivation was clearly survival in a life-or-death situation, this ability to present a false front is also crucial for understanding how certain harmful individuals operate within society, perhaps for personal gain, to exert power, or to manipulate others.
Now, despite dealing with such a dark and potentially sensational topic, the book makes a deliberate choice, doesn't it, to avoid really graphic descriptions of criminal behavior and suffering. Why do you think the author made that decision?
The author makes it very clear, actually. The intention is not to shock the reader with gruesome details, but rather to focus on the underlying general laws of the origin of evil.
Right.
The author felt that focusing on specific, emotionally charged events, while maybe grabbing immediate attention, would ultimately detract from the broader patterns and fundamental principles they were trying to identify and understand.
So the aim is to understand the core mechanisms at play, rather than just being horrified by the resulting actions. That makes a lot of sense, actually. And the book also argues that understanding the complex problems we face today, really understanding them, requires us to challenge our usual ways of thinking quite significantly.
Absolutely. The author emphasizes the urgent need to step outside our natural egotism and well-known concepts if we truly want to grasp the direction our world is heading, even hinting at significant global risks like potential catastrophe. The argument is that there might be powerful forces at work that our everyday, comfortable ways of thinking simply aren't equipped to comprehend.
It's a call, then, to really question our assumptions and move beyond what the book terms everyday illusory thinking for the sake of both our individual well-being and, well, the well-being of society as a whole.
Precisely. And this need to look beyond the surface also applies to the field of psychology itself. The book discusses how our own internal anxieties and the prevailing social and political climate can significantly shape our understanding of psychological phenomena, sometimes in distorting ways.
You mean our own biases and the pressures of the society we live in can actually affect how we understand mental health and human behavior?
Exactly. The book points out that while some individuals driven by their own internal anxieties can actually make valuable contributions through their search for order and self-knowledge,
Okay.
there's also a real danger of these anxieties leading to a skewed understanding of fundamental human nature. And moreover, in societies under political oppression, psychology becomes particularly vulnerable to censorship and manipulation, with those in power basically dictating what is considered scientific truth.
So, genuine psychological inquiry can be hampered by both our internal biases and external political pressures. That makes sense. And this leads to the book's point that our ordinary, everyday worldviews have inherent limitations when trying to understand these deeper issues.
Yes. Our usual understanding of psychology, society, morality, it's all shaped by a multitude of factors, right? Our individual upbringing, our inherent personality traits, the cultural influences around us, and so on.
Right.
Because of this complex interplay of influences, our natural worldview, while often functional in our daily lives, isn't necessarily universally applicable or completely accurate, especially when we're dealing with more extreme or unusual phenomena. Individual and national differences arise from this combination of our innate predispositions and our personal development.
It sounds like the researchers behind this work are involved in this line of thinking had to go through a significant process of questioning their own basic assumptions and long-held beliefs.
They did indeed. The book describes a period of real crisis and frustration when their established psychological concepts proved inadequate for understanding what they termed macrosocial evil, large-scale harm that affects entire societies. They were forced to confront the limitations of their existing theoretical frameworks.
And the crucial step in moving forward was what? To embrace that feeling of not knowing, to accept their limitations.
Precisely. They had to embrace a feeling of nescience, a kind of intellectual humility, and basically venture into less familiar territory. They had to be guided by a rigorous analysis of observed facts and adhere strictly to the principles of scientific methodology,
Right.
all while being mindful of both the external pressures they faced and, importantly, their own inherent biases. It's about letting the evidence lead, even when it challenges your most deeply held beliefs.
The book also makes a really interesting point about psychological differences being a fundamental aspect of human nature, almost like a natural law. That's a different way of looking at it.
It is. The author argues that accepting these inherent psychological differences among individuals, rather than trying to force everyone into a single mold or ideal, is essential for gaining a truly objective understanding of both individuals and societies.
Right.
This perspective also leads to the perhaps uncomfortable realization that while we can and absolutely should strive for equality under the law,
Of course.
we are not all inherently equal under what the book calls the law of nature in terms of our psychological makeup and predispositions.
Now, the book touches on this idea of consciously tracking our own psychological processes, which could potentially lead to an awareness of suprasensory causation.
Yeah.
That ventures into some pretty unusual territory for a book primarily focused on political psychology, doesn't it?
It does touch on areas that might seem a bit outside the typical scope of traditional psychology, yeah. The book proposes that through consistent and careful self-reflection and analysis of our own internal psychological mechanisms, we might become aware of phenomena operating at very subtle levels of biopsychological energy, even hinting at connections to what ancient religious traditions have described as suprasensory causation.
Interesting.
It's presented as a very personal and potentially profound journey of self-discovery and heightened awareness.
It's almost like suggesting that by understanding ourselves really deeply, we might glimpse a larger, perhaps more interconnected reality.
Mm.
And the book also emphasizes that human personality isn't fixed. It's constantly in a state of flux and evolution throughout our lives.
Exactly. The book stresses that lifelong personality development and change are not only normal but actually healthy.
Okay.
In fact, it suggests that systems, whether political, social, or even personal ideologies that advocate for a slowing down or an excessive stabilization of personality development are actually psychologically unhealthy.
Hmm.
When this natural evolution becomes stuck or frozen for too long, it can even contribute to the development of psychopathology. Change and adaptation are presented as key indicators of psychological well-being.
This really highlights the complexity of human beings, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The book cautions against trying to oversimplify things, especially in the social sciences.
Absolutely. The human personality, with its intricate structure, its continuous changes, and its rich inner mental and spiritual life, simply cannot be adequately captured or understood through overly simplistic models.
Right.
The book strongly cautions against the use of oversimplifying schemes in the social sciences and emphasizes the critical need to respect this inherent complexity if we want our understanding to have any real-world practical value.
So our everyday language.
Right. Our everyday language and intuitive psychological understanding, while useful in daily life, just cannot replace the need for objective, scientifically grounded premises when analyzing these deeper phenomena.
Now, the book introduces this concept of individuals exhibiting morbid phenomena and being driven by an overcompensation drive. Who are these people it's describing?
Well, these are individuals who display various mental deviations and anomalies. They're often characterized by a strong internal sense of anxiety and a tendency to seek out unconventional paths in life, sometimes exhibiting a high degree of hyperactivity.
Okay.
Now, while some in society might view these individuals as pioneers or highly creative types, the book offers a more critical perspective.
How so?
It suggests that their hyperactivity and their often inflated sense of their own exceptionality can actually stem from an unconscious drive to overcompensate for underlying feelings of inadequacy or deficiency.
So what might appear as extraordinary talent or drive could actually be rooted in a deep-seated feeling of not being enough. That's a significant reinterpretation.
It is.
And the book ultimately concludes that normal, well-adjusted people are actually the richest of all, psychologically.
Yes, it challenges that common perception that these seemingly extraordinary, perhaps deviant individuals are somehow superior or more fulfilled. The book posits that true psychological richness and well-being are found in the more balanced and integrated psychological makeup of individuals who are generally considered normal.
It sounds like the author felt that the existing understanding of psychopathology, particularly as it relates to broader social issues and the emergence of harmful behaviors on a large scale, was pretty inadequate at the time.
Precisely. The book explicitly acknowledges that the overall state of knowledge regarding psychopathology that is relevant to understanding social life is unsatisfactory, with many in the scientific community treating it as, well, a marginal concern.
Right.
The central aim of political ponerology is really to illuminate the underlying causative factors behind phenomena that have largely been described and documented, but not fully explained in terms of their psychological origins and mechanisms.
So it's an attempt to move beyond simply describing what we observe to actually understanding why it happens in the first place.
Exactly.
And this leads to the book's emphasis on the deep interdependence between individual fate, personality, and the development of society as a whole.
Yes, the book argues that to truly understand the course of individual lives, the development of personality, and the trajectory of societies, we must recognize the profound interconnectedness of these three elements.
Okay.
It's not just about studying individual psychology in isolation or looking at societal structures as separate entities, but understanding how they constantly influence and shape one another in this really dynamic interplay.
The book also highlights the really crucial role that our concepts of psychology, the way we think and talk about it, play in shaping our culture and our fundamental moral and social attitudes.
Absolutely. The quality and the richness of the concepts we use to understand psychological phenomena, both on an individual level and as a society, have a direct and significant impact on the development of our moral compass and the nature of our social interactions.
How so?
Well, how accurately we understand ourselves and those around us directly conditions the decisions and choices we make in all aspects of our lives, from personal relationships right up to political engagement.
Now let's delve into the book's observations about individuals who attain positions of power, not because of their competence or merit, but through privilege or other means. The book has some pretty strong insights on this.
It does. It describes individuals who rise to high positions due to their connections, their family background, or other forms of unearned advantage, rather than through demonstrated ability.
Right.
These individuals tend to shy away from genuinely challenging problems, preferring instead to focus on superficial, often showy tasks that give the appearance of activity.
Mhm.
Over time, their capacity for sound reasoning can deteriorate, and feeling insecure in their roles, they may actively work to undermine and remove more talented individuals who they perceive as a threat. This creates a climate of injustice and what the book calls downward adaptation. And interestingly, it suggests that such individuals are often drawn to and favor totalitarian forms of government, which offer them a greater degree of protection from being exposed as incompetent.
That's a pretty sharp critique. And the book contrasts this with the idea of a truly just social structure. What does that look like in the book's view?
Well, it advocates for a just social structure that is grounded in the natural laws of individual adjustment, things like creativity, dynamism, a drive for self-improvement, rather than being based on rigid ideologies or inherited doctrines.
Okay.
The underlying principle is that society as a whole benefits when individuals are given the opportunity and support to find self-realization in accordance with these natural tendencies, balancing their own individual interests with the common good.
The sheer size and population density of very large nations are also presented in the book as a potential hindrance to the development of a healthy societal psychological worldview and effective governance. Why is that?
Well, in countries with enormous populations spread across vast distances, individuals can often feel disconnected from the central governing structures and, frankly, powerless to influence high-level political processes.
Right, that makes sense.
The sense of a shared national identity and community can become diluted, and the very scale of the nation can make the underlying societal structure feel distant and intangible.
So it's harder to connect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This can make it more difficult to develop a cohesive and healthy societal psychological worldview, and it can also present significant challenges for effective and responsive governance.
The cyclical nature of societies, the way good times often seem to lead to bad times, is something we see throughout history. The book connects this cycle to the acquisition and loss of psychological knowledge. Can you explain that connection?
Certainly. The book suggests that during periods of prosperity and peace, the good times, there's often a decreased sense of urgency for deep reflection on human nature and the potential for future difficulties.
Complacency sets in.
Sort of. When life seems relatively easy and stable, there's less immediate incentive to ponder complex psychological truths or the underlying factors that can lead to suffering. Individuals who raise concerns or predict future problems might even be viewed negatively as pessimistic or disruptive.
So in these seemingly comfortable times, we can become complacent and lose sight of important psychological realities.
Yeah.
And what are the consequences of this collective forgetting?
Well, this can lead to an impoverishment of psychological knowledge within the society, a reduced ability to understand the complexities of human behavior and personality,
Okay.
and a diminished capacity to guide and shape minds in constructive and resilient ways. In such times, the superficial cult of power can sometimes supplant the essential mental and moral values that are actually necessary for maintaining social order and stability through peaceful means. The book even suggests that the state of a nation's psychological worldview during these periods can be an important indicator of its future resilience and prospects.
But difficult times can also serve a valuable purpose, can't they?
Yeah.
They can act as a catalyst for reevaluating and correcting our values and understanding.
Yes, absolutely. Challenging and difficult periods can give rise to new values and a renewed focus on understanding the deeper realities of human nature.
Oh.
The ability to analyze situations accurately without being swayed by excessive emotions or self-interest becomes crucial for meaningful philosophical, psychological, and moral reflection. This can potentially tip the balance towards positive change and a more accurate understanding of the world. However, the book also reminds us that collective memory is often fragile, and the hard-won wisdom gained from past struggles can be easily forgotten or dismissed over time.
The book also discusses the narrowing of worldviews and the potential for increased societal hysteria during prolonged periods of peace. That sounds like a dangerous combination.
It is. The book suggests that extended periods of peace and stability can paradoxically lead to a narrowing of individual and collective perspectives and an increase in self-centeredness. This can make societies more vulnerable to irrational fears and widespread hysteria when unexpected crises do arise, potentially leading to a state of general despondency.
And this weakness varies.
Yes, the degree to which a nation's collective mind and personality become weakened during these peaceful times can vary significantly, ultimately affecting its ability to effectively weather future storms.
And the book points out that significant social difficulties might not surface immediately after a psychological crisis, but can emerge years later, almost as a delayed reaction.
Exactly. The book notes that significant social tensions, unrest, and other difficulties often don't manifest until some years after the initial signs of recovery from a major psychological crisis within a society.
Hmm.
These can be delayed consequences of the original trauma, or perhaps triggered by the same underlying psychological processes that were initially at play. This delayed reaction means there's often a limited window of opportunity for implementing effective countermeasures.
The author then shifts focus a bit to Europe and America, questioning any assumption of inherent superiority between them regarding societal sickness or dysfunction.
Yeah, the book explicitly challenges any notion of inherent superiority of one region over the other, particularly given Europe's own history of significant societal struggles.
Right.
Instead of viewing one as inherently healthier, it suggests that European nations, drawing on their extensive historical experience and potentially more developed modern psychology in certain areas, might actually be in a position to offer valuable insights and assistance to America in understanding and addressing its own challenges.
The book emphasizes that developing proper thinking and achieving an accurate understanding of reality requires significant effort.
Right.
Overcoming our natural laziness, engaging in dedicated scientific inquiry, it's not something that just comes easily.
No, it absolutely requires conscious and sustained effort, a willingness to overcome our inherent tendencies towards intellectual laziness, and a commitment to rigorous scientific work, often under conditions that are far from our usual comfort zones.
But it's worth it.
Well, the book argues that engaging in this kind of challenging intellectual work can lead to profound positive transformations, even in individuals with highly ego-driven personalities, prompting genuine intellectual and moral reflection.
It's striking how the book notes the relative lack of focused study on the fundamental nature, causes, and origins of evil compared to the extensive discussions around, say, justice and virtue. Why do you think that imbalance exists?
The book proposes several potential reasons for this relative neglect. Maybe the specific social and historical context in which thinkers have operated, potential personal risks associated with such inquiries, deeply ingrained traditional perspectives,
Or even suppression.
or even, the deliberate suppression of such knowledge by those who might be exposed by it. While literature certainly explores the theme of evil, it often doesn't delve down to the foundational, primeval source of these phenomena in a systematic, scientific way, leaving a significant cognitive gap in our understanding.
So, the really deep roots of evil have often remained unexamined by rigorous scientific inquiry. However, the book suggests that valuable psychological insight can sometimes be gained even through direct personal experience of injustice. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, the book suggests that psychologists who themselves become the targets or witnesses of abuse or injustice can gain particularly valuable observations, provided they can maintain a degree of cognitive detachment and allow their intellectual curiosity to outweigh their immediate emotional reactions.
Okay.
Additionally, their professional skills can be invaluable in navigating and ultimately overcoming such difficult situations. The author actually mentions their own personal experiences with injustice in their homeland as a significant source of insights that informed their work.
And looking at individuals who inflict harm on others, the book cites a specific study that suggests psychopathological factors are present in the vast majority of such cases. That's a significant finding.
It is. The study cited in the book indicates that only a very small percentage of individuals who engage in harmful actions did not exhibit identifiable psychopathological factors that likely influence their behavior.
Wow.
The book also makes the important point that even if the psychologist fails to detect such factors in a particular case, it doesn't necessarily mean they aren't there.
Right.
This perspective stands in stark contrast to more common, everyday moralistic interpretations of evil and traditional juridical practices, which often don't fully take these underlying pathological characteristics into account.
So how should we approach it?
The book proposes using what it calls the exclusionary hypothesis, essentially asking whether a particular harmful act would have occurred in the absence of any identifiable pathological component as a way to better understand the role these factors play.
So pathological factors appear to play a much more significant role in the genesis of harmful behavior than we might typically assume in our everyday moral judgments. The book then moves on to discuss specific types of these pathological factors, starting with characteropathy. What exactly does that term encompass?
Well, characteropaths, as the book defines them, represent specific types of personality deviations and anomalies that, through their often subtle and covert activities, can act as powerful catalysts, easily initiating new phases in the development and spread of evil.
Catalysts for evil.
In a sense, yes. The author emphasizes that their selection of these particular characteropathies is based on extensive personal experience and observation of these dynamics in action.
And the book offers a specific example with Kaiser Wilhelm II and his potential impact on a large societal scale, possibly linked to a characteropathy stemming from a brain injury at birth. That's a pretty specific and potentially controversial example.
It is a specific example offered by the author, yes, to illustrate how a characteropathic personality in a position of significant power might exert influence and contribute to events on a macrosocial level.
Right.
The book connects Wilhelm II's potential birth-related brain trauma to certain aspects of his behavior, and the increasing wave of hysteria observed in Europe during his time, suggesting a possible link between individual pathology and broader societal trends. But it's important to remember this is presented as one specific example to illustrate a broader principle, not necessarily a definitive diagnosis.
Understood. The book makes the assertion that traditional historical explanations often fall short when trying to understand the events of the first half of the 20th century, and that a ponerological approach, one that specifically takes pathological factors into account, is necessary to get a more complete picture.
Exactly. The author argues that the standard categories and analytical tools typically used in historical analysis are often insufficient to fully account for the complexities and the sheer scale of the destructive events of that era.
So we need something more.
The book contends that a ponerological approach, which systematically considers the influence of various pathological factors operating at all levels of society, from individuals to institutions, is essential for a more comprehensive and accurate understanding of those historical events.
And it uses an analogy.
Yeah, the analogy of the German nation being psychologically influenced by pathologically altered psychological material, similar to individuals raised by characteropathic and hysterical parents, is used to illustrate how widespread influence by individuals with these traits can lead to devastating societal outcomes.
The book also discusses the influence of individuals with paranoid traits. While many normal people tend to avoid them, they can still wield considerable power and influence within certain groups. How does that work?
Well, the book explains that while individuals with well-developed critical thinking skills tend to avoid those with pronounced paranoid tendencies, their power lies in their ability to captivate and control less critical minds. This includes individuals with other psychological vulnerabilities and younger, more impressionable people. While acceptance of paranoid arguments rarely reaches a majority within a population, it is apparently more frequent in communities with lower levels of education and critical thinking.
And the cause.
The book suggests a twofold psychological mechanism behind paranoid phenomena, potentially stemming from actual brain tissue damage in some cases, and from functional or behavioral causes in others.
Stalin is also cited in the book as an example of what it terms a ponerogenic characteropathy, with a potential link to perinatal brain damage. The list of characteristics attributed to him is quite disturbing.
Yes, Stalin is presented as another significant example of a characteropathy with a high degree of ponerogenic potential, meaning a strong capacity to generate evil and harm.
What kind of traits?
The book lists several characteristics attributed to him. Extreme brutality, a manipulative form of charisma described as snake charming, a tendency to issue absolute and irrevocable decisions, inhuman ruthlessness, pathological vengefulness, and a deeply ingrained egotistical belief in his own genius, despite possessing what the book describes as only average intellectual abilities. These traits are again linked, speculatively, to the possibility of perinatal brain damage.
The book even touches on the impact of physical interventions, explaining how cytostatic drugs used in medical treatment can sometimes lead to significant personality changes by affecting brain tissue.
Yes. The book explains how cytostatic drugs, which are used in cancer treatment, can unfortunately attack older, more instinctive areas of the brain, impacting fundamental feelings and emotional intuition.
And the result?
This can result in noticeable personality shifts, including an increased need for praise, pronounced egocentricity, a marked indifference to the feelings of others, and disproportionately vengeful reactions to even minor criticism. The book notes that these changes can be particularly tragic when they occur in individuals who were previously well regarded and respected.
So all these various types of characteropathy, whether rooted in potential brain injury or other psychological deviations, can contribute to the initial stages of evil's genesis,
Yeah.
not only on a large societal scale, but also within individual families and smaller groups.
That seems to be the argument, yes.
This leads the book to suggest some pretty significant potential changes to our social systems, doesn't it?
It does. The book ultimately argues for the development of social systems that are better equipped to protect both individuals and society as a whole by preventing individuals with these kinds of pathological deviations from attaining and holding positions of significant power and influence.
How?
It even proposes the creation of a specialized institution composed of wise individuals with expertise in both medicine and psychology to help address these complex issues at a societal level.
The book also discusses how we, as readers, often interpret the works of authors who might have underlying psychological anomalies, suggesting that our own psychological makeup can play a significant role in how we understand their creations.
Exactly. The book points out that readers often misinterpret the works of authors who have underlying psychological anomalies, like maybe schizoidal tendencies, primarily because they are unaware of the author's true psychological condition.
So we project onto them.
We tend to project our own normal psychological experiences and perspectives onto the work. The book suggests that individuals with a more balanced psychological makeup tend towards a more corrective interpretation, while others might react to these works with moral revulsion without fully understanding the specific psychological factors at play.
And it gives an example.
Yeah, as an example, the book uses the varied interpretations and social reactions to the works of Karl Marx to illustrate this point about reader perception.
The book paints a rather stark picture of the psychopath's internal experience, describing a lack of genuine insight into themselves and others, and what it calls bleached emotions.
Yes, the book describes the psychopath as being fundamentally self-deceived about their apparent normalcy. They often lack the capacity for genuine self-reflection and insight into their own condition and, crucially, the true emotional experiences of others.
Bleached emotions.
Their own subjective emotional landscape is described as so diminished, so bleached, that they genuinely struggle to comprehend the depth and meaning of life for others. This often leads to genuine bewilderment when their promises or word of honor are not immediately accepted as truthful.
And their understanding of fundamental human experiences like love and religious faith is similarly skewed, often viewed with a sense of disbelief or as mere fairy tales for others.
That's right. Individuals with psychopathy, according to the book, are largely unfamiliar with the experience of enduring genuine love, particularly within marriage, often viewing it as a kind of romanticized fairy tale. Their understanding of what others call love tends to be more fleeting and focused on, perhaps, sexual gratification or adventure. Similarly, religious teachings that emphasize love for one's neighbor and compassion are often seen as idealistic but ultimately unrealistic concepts meant for other people, not really applicable to their own lives and experiences.
Despite these significant internal differences, the book notes that psychopaths do attempt to mask their true nature and blend in with normal society, but with varying degrees of success.
They do. While some individuals with psychopathic traits may be more obviously strange or off-putting in their behavior, others are remarkably adept at adapting to the norms of social life. Sometimes they even exploit society's appreciation for artistic talent or intellectual pursuits.
But there's still something.
Ah,
Well, the book suggests that even in these cases, the underlying motivations and the purely ideational content of their creative work can be deeply unsettling when viewed through a lens of understanding their psychological differences. This leads to the concept in the book of a ponerogenic network, a kind of interconnected web of individuals with deviant psychological traits operating somewhat outside the boundaries of the normal community.
yes, the book describes how individuals with psychopathic traits, along with others exhibiting various forms of psychological deviance, tend to form a network with shared collusions and understandings, existing somewhat apart from the mainstream community of psychologically normal individuals.
And psychopathy is key.
Essential psychopathy often plays a key inspirational role within this network, according to the book. They tend to share an us versus them worldview, operate by their own often unspoken set of rules, and harbor a tendency to deceive and hold in contempt the values and norms of the normal world.
The book also revisits the pre-Freudian understanding of subconscious psychological processes, highlighting how these can lead to unconscious biases in our thinking, such as blocking uncomfortable conclusions.
Yes, it's important to remember that the understanding of subconscious psychological phenomena predates Freud. The book points out how these unconscious processes can lead to the subconscious rejection of certain conclusions and the substitution of more comfortable or self-serving premises, even without our conscious awareness.
Recognizing individuals who have a spellbinding effect on others as potentially having pathological traits is presented as a way to move beyond simply moralizing their actions and towards a more objective understanding and response.
Exactly. When we recognize that a person's extraordinary ability to manipulate or captivate others might stem from underlying pathological traits, it allows us to move away from simplistic moral judgments and towards a more objective assessment of their behavior and its potential impact.
So understanding helps.
Identifying the pathological basis behind such spellbinding can open the door to more modern and effective ways of addressing the situation rather than just reacting emotionally.
Interestingly, the book notes that having a high IQ offers only limited protection against being spellbound by such individuals. What factors offer more significant resistance then?
Well, while a high IQ can provide some degree of defense, it's apparently not the most crucial factor. The book argues that a well-developed basic intelligence, which shapes our perception of psychological reality, is more decisive in fostering a critical and discerning attitude.
So psychological perception.
Right. It's this grounded understanding of human nature that offers greater protection against the manipulative tactics of spellbinders who can effectively husk out individuals who lack this kind of psychological acuity, regardless of their raw IQ score.
The book introduces specific criteria of ponerogenesis, essentially warning signs that a harmful association or group dynamic might be developing. The first criterion mentioned is the atrophy or weakening of natural critical faculties, specifically when dealing with pathological individuals.
Yes, the inability or unwillingness to critically evaluate the behavior and motivations of individuals who exhibit pathological traits is presented as a key indicator that a potentially harmful association is forming or has taken hold. This atrophy of natural critical faculties is a significant warning sign of ponerogenesis.
And another key criterion is the statistically high concentration of individuals with various psychological anomalies within these developing groups.
That's right. Ponerogenic associations tend to have a disproportionately high number of individuals exhibiting a range of psychological anomalies. And the specific types and combination of these anomalies within the group are also crucial in determining the overall character and direction of the association.
This can lead to the ponerization of initially normal groups, where the group's dynamics and values become increasingly influenced by these pathological factors.
Precisely. Groups that may have started out with relatively normal individuals and intentions can gradually be infiltrated and significantly influenced by the presence of individuals with pathological traits. This leads to a transformation of the group's norms and behaviors in a process the book calls ponerization.
And these groups are different.
These primarily ponerogenic unions are often characterized as being out of sync with the broader societal values and norms, and they typically struggle to achieve widespread acceptance or influence.
The book describes a critical liminal situation or watershed moment where the erosion of common sense and moral judgment within a group accelerates. What characterizes this stage?
This liminal situation marks a point where the group has been sufficiently influenced by pathological elements to begin to view individuals who are not entirely normal as possessing unique genius or insight.
Okay.
This distorted perception then creates pressure on the more psychologically normal members of the group, who may be subtly or overtly criticized for their lack of vision or seen as morally deficient. This leads to a form of psychological coercion or terror.
And this sets the stage for counterselection,
Right.
where the more psychologically healthy individuals tend to leave the group, while those with more pronounced anomalies are drawn in, creating a feedback loop that further reinforces the pathological dynamics.
Exactly. The individuals who retain a stronger connection to psychological normalcy tend to withdraw from the increasingly dysfunctional group, while those with various psychological anomalies find the environment more comfortable and validating. This allows them to gradually discard any pretense of normalcy they might have previously maintained.
And within these polarizing groups, spellbinders play a crucial role in maintaining what the book calls ideological purity. How do they achieve this?
Well, spellbinders act as enforcers of the group's distorted ideology. They often use manipulative tactics to condemn any doubt or criticism as morally reprehensible, while simultaneously presenting psychologically and morally pathological opinions with an air of authority and dignity. They effectively eliminate any intellectual connections or lines of reasoning that might expose the underlying pathology, often through subconscious premise substitution.
And the comparison used.
The book makes a disturbing comparison, likening this state to the inmates of an asylum running the institution, with the entire association adopting a deceptive facade of normalcy, which the book terms the dissimulative phase.
The book suggests that the decline or atrophy of a clear hierarchy of values in both individuals and societies is a strong indication of underlying societal problems, potentially leading to governmental paralysis and widespread social hysterization.
That's right. The erosion of a shared and coherent system of values within individuals and throughout society is presented as a significant symptom of deeper issues, often contributing to a breakdown in effective governance.
And this connects to hysteria.
Yes, such periods of crisis are frequently associated with social hysterization, and the ensuing tragic events and societal collapses often leave a sense of inadequacy in purely historical or moral analyses, which often overlook the crucial underlying psychological factors.
The book also briefly mentions the contagious nature of hysterical states, referencing the discoveries of the renowned neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot.
Yes, it's just a reminder that hysterical states are not necessarily confined to isolated individuals, but can spread within a population, a phenomenon that Charcot extensively studied and documented in his work on hysteria back in 19th century Europe.
The book proposes that a new science, presumably this ponerology it's been outlining, can offer a rational and scientific justification for values that might be overlooked in times of crisis, providing a path towards greater understanding and even forgiveness.
Absolutely. This emerging discipline, by providing a framework for understanding the psychological roots of harmful actions and societal dysfunction, can offer a scientific basis for values that might be easily dismissed or overshadowed by immediate political pressures or instinctive desires for revenge.
And the potential outcome.
The book suggests that by rigorously applying this understanding, we can scientifically validate these values and potentially pave the way for unprecedented levels of forgiveness as a means of countering the persistent threat of evil in the world. Though it clarifies that understanding and forgiveness should not be mistaken for excusing harmful behavior or abandoning the need for correction and prevention.
So resolving the complex, interconnected problems facing our world today might necessitate the development and application of this new discipline, as traditional, forceful solutions alone are proving insufficient.
The book argues exactly that. The intricate and deeply rooted nature of macrosocial pathological phenomena requires a new set of tools for analysis and resolution. Traditional approaches that rely primarily on the application of force are no longer adequate to address these complex underlying issues. The development and thoughtful application of this new discipline are presented as essential for truly effective solutions.
Even within oppressive pathocratic systems, the book notes that individuals with essential skills might still be utilized, and many people adapt by outwardly conforming while harboring private doubts and seeking alternatives within trusted circles.
Yes, even in the most rigidly controlled pathocratic systems, individuals who possess skills that are deemed necessary for the functioning of the state may still be employed, even if they don't fully subscribe to the ruling ideology.
How do they cope?
Many people in such systems adapt by outwardly accepting the status quo in order to survive and function, while privately harboring doubts and seeking out like-minded individuals within trusted networks where they can explore alternative ideas and hope for a better future. These deficiently faithful individuals, as the book describes them, actually contribute to the underlying instability and internal weakness of pathocratic systems.
The book acknowledges the high cost associated with the eventual dismantling of communist subjugation, but also cautions that nations that now consider themselves free may soon face new and unforeseen challenges.
Right. The end of communist rule in many parts of the world came at a significant human and economic cost. But the book warns that nations that have emerged from this period and now consider themselves free may soon encounter new forms of societal and political challenges.
Because the underlying problem persists.
Well, while the military might of the original ideological bloc was dismantled, the underlying dynamics of pathocracy, as the book outlines, can potentially reemerge in different guises and under new ideological banners.
The book highlights the inherent danger within all ideologies, even those that seem to be based on noble values, and describes pathocracy as a kind of insidious parasite that can attach itself to and exploit these ideologies.
The book offers a really strong cautionary note here. Even ideologies that appear to be founded on admirable principles can, if embraced uncritically, deprive individuals of their capacity for self-reflection and critical thinking.
How so?
Adherents can become so fixated on achieving the stated ideal that they lose sight of the ethical implications of the methods they employ. The dangerous principle that the end justifies the means can create an opening for individuals with pathological tendencies to use these grand ideas as a justification for abandoning normal human decency and customs.
So any ideology is vulnerable.
Ultimately, the book concludes that every powerful ideology carries a potential risk and can become a vulnerable host for the parasitic influence of pathocracy.
Drawing on the insights of early psychiatric pioneers, the book emphasizes the importance of distinguishing between the underlying disease or pathology and the specific system of delusions that a patient might develop. It suggests that similar delusional systems can arise from different underlying causes.
Exactly. Just as early psychiatric thinkers recognized the need to differentiate between the fundamental etiological causes of a mental illness and the particular set of delusions a patient might exhibit.
Right.
The book suggests that various ideological systems, which it views as potentially delusional in the context of pathocracy, can manifest even when the underlying societal pathology is the same. And conversely, superficially similar ideological systems might even arise from different underlying societal diseases shaped by specific historical, cultural, and individual factors.
The book identifies several characteristic symptoms of a pathocratic ideology, including the use of double talk and the creation of suggestive names that are often accepted uncritically, particularly by those outside the immediate control of the system.
Yes, these are presented as key indicators. Double talk, the deliberate use of ambiguous or contradictory language to obscure truth or mislead, is one common symptom.
And names.
Another is the creation and widespread adoption of new, often emotionally charged names or labels that are accepted without critical examination, especially by those not directly subject to the pathocratic regime. These names often carry hidden paramoralistic and paranoidal undertones.
Paramoralisms.
Right. The book explains how paralogism's flawed reasoning and paramoralism's distorted moral judgments function within this deformed ideology. Anything that poses a threat to pathocratic rule is automatically labeled as deeply immoral, even including acts of forgiveness towards the pathocrats themselves.
Expansionism is presented not as a core tenet of any particular ideology, but rather as an intrinsic characteristic of pathocracy itself, often masked or justified by the prevailing ideology.
That's a crucial distinction the book makes. The inherent drive to expand its sphere of influence and control, according to the book, stems from the very nature of pathocracy, not from the specific ideology it happens to adopt.
So the ideology is just a cover.
The ideology merely serves as a convenient mask or justification for this inherent imperialistic tendency, which has historically been a consistent feature of this type of societal phenomenon. This contrasts sharply with normal, healthy governments, where the imposition of such a system is deeply abhorrent, and efforts are made to contain its spread in favor of more humane and just forms of governance.
Ultimately, the book brings us back to the idea that individual and national suffering is the result of a complex interplay between moral deficiencies, intellectual failings, and underlying pathological factors.
Yes, these three elements are seen as interconnected in a causative network that ultimately leads to both individual tragedies and widespread suffering on a national and even global scale. Understanding these interrelationships is key to addressing these complex problems effectively.
The book also points out that psychological warfare can be a surprisingly efficient and cost-effective means of exerting influence and control, even on a global scale, often being far cheaper than traditional military conflicts.
Yeah, the book highlights the strategic advantage, if you will, of psychological warfare, noting that it can be a remarkably efficient and relatively inexpensive way to exert influence and achieve political objectives, even across vast distances, especially when compared to the immense costs and human toll of traditional warfare.
Interestingly, the book suggests that individuals who are serving the interests of a pathocracy might be operating under a variety of different, even seemingly contradictory ideological banners.
That's a key point. The primary allegiance of these individuals is not necessarily to the specific ideology they profess, but rather to the underlying pathocratic system itself.
So they can switch masks.
They may strategically adopt different, even opposing ideological stances as a means to further the pathocracy's goals. This requires a strong commitment to the pathocratic agenda to overcome any potential self-suggestion from the adopted ideology.
But amidst this rather bleak picture, The book offers a glimmer of hope, mentioning the eventual formation of a powerful, interconnected network of what it calls the Society of Normal People.
Yes, despite the oppressive nature of pathocracy, the book anticipates the eventual emergence of a resilient and interconnected network of individuals who retain their psychological normalcy and who recognize the fundamentally pathological nature of the system under which they are living. This network becomes a vital source of resistance and hope for a better future.
Pathocracy itself is described as a kind of accelerated and infectious imposition of the principles of independent ponerogenesis on a larger scale. Can you break that down a bit?
Essentially, the book views the establishment of a pathocratic regime as a condensed and intensified version of the natural process by which harmful social phenomena of ponerogenesis can arise independently within a society.
And it mentions an initial phase.
Yes, there might even be an initial period of increased activity and influence by individuals with certain personality types, like those with schizoidal traits, perhaps under less competent predecessors, who fail to realize that the pathocratic system will ultimately not fulfill their own aspirations for genuine change or improvement.
Understanding this complex phenomenon requires the development of a comprehensive and precise conceptual language, much like needing to learn the specific terminology of a technical field to properly understand and work within it.
Exactly. The book emphasizes the critical need to develop an appropriate and nuanced conceptual vocabulary to truly understand the intricacies of this macrosocial phenomenon. This requires a significant investment of time and intellectual effort.
Like learning electronics.
Right. Similar to the dedication needed to learn the technical language of a field like electronics in order to effectively diagnose and repair televisions. Gaining this understanding within its own specific reference system unlocks a much deeper level of insight.
The book makes a crucial distinction, clarifying that in a fully established pathocracy, the individuals who hold the real power are not necessarily the fanatical ideological zealots,
No.
but rather those with specific underlying pathological characteristics who skillfully use the ideology as a tool for control and manipulation.
Precisely. In a mature pathocracy, the individuals who occupy the highest positions of power and exert the most influence are not necessarily the most fervent believers in the stated ideology. Instead, they are those who possess the specific pathological characteristics and functional traits that enable them to effectively maintain control and manipulate the population, using the ideology as a convenient instrument to achieve their ends.
So they stand above the party.
These individuals, with their particular psychological makeup and the roles they fulfill, effectively operate above and beyond the rank-and-file members of the ideological party.
Pathocracy creates a unique kind of polarization within the population, dividing people along lines that are different from typical economic or ideological divisions, making it often difficult for outsiders to fully comprehend.
Yes, the lines of division created by pathocracy don't neatly align with traditional categories of economic class or political ideology. Instead, the population becomes polarized in a way that is often difficult for those who haven't experienced it firsthand to fully grasp without specialized understanding.
But people sense it.
Within the affected population, an intuitive sense of these new divisions gradually takes shape. Traditional concepts of economic problems and social injustice often prove inadequate for understanding the fundamental dynamics at play in a pathocratic society.
Drawing an analogy to the understanding of disease, the book suggests that a thorough understanding of the etiology and pathodynamics of pathocracy, its origins and the way it functions, is essential for ultimately finding a cure.
Right. Just as a comprehensive understanding of the causes and the mechanisms of a disease is crucial for developing effective treatments, the book argues that a deep and thorough comprehension of the macrosocial pathological phenomenon of pathocracy, its origins, its nature, how it operates, is the essential first step towards identifying and implementing effective strategies for overcoming it.
The book uses a powerful analogy involving colorblindness to illustrate how essential psychopathy at the core of pathocracy might lead to the suppression of normal psychological understanding within a society. Can you explain that analogy?
Yeah, it's quite illustrative. The book uses the analogy of a society where Daltonists, or colorblind individuals, come to power and then proceed to forbid any distinction between the colors red and green.
Okay.
This illustrates how individuals with essential psychopathy, who lack normal emotional and empathetic understanding, might similarly suppress and even punish the expression of normal psychological insights and the recognition of genuine human emotions.
And the enforcers.
The inspectors in this analogy, who would be tasked with enforcing this distorted reality, would themselves need to be near colorblind and would likely become nervous or hostile towards any discussions about the subtle differences between colors, just as pathocrats are often made uneasy by discussions of genuine human emotions and motivations.
The book also discusses how prolonged exposure to individuals with pathological traits can have a profound effect, almost saturating a person with their characteristic psychological material, as tragically seen in survivors of concentration camps.
Yes, this prolonged and intense exposure to individuals exhibiting pathological traits can have a deep and lasting impact, essentially imprinting some of their characteristic psychological patterns onto their victims. The experiences of survivors of concentration camps serve as a stark example of this phenomenon.
But there's hope.
However, the book suggests that an awareness of this process can be a crucial step in helping individuals to shed this psychological burden and reconnect with the normal world, and that statistical data on psychopathy can actually be a helpful tool in this process.
The book even touches on the programming of prisoners of war with pathological material, highlighting the need for specialized deprogramming therapy upon their return.
Yeah, the experiences of American soldiers returning from North Vietnamese prison camps who had been subjected to intensive psychological manipulation and programming with what the book would likely consider pathological ideological material. That underscores the reality of this kind of psychological influence.
And the need for therapy.
And the subsequent need for specialized therapeutic interventions, often referred to as deprogramming, to help these individuals reintegrate and recover. A process that unfortunately sometimes faced resistance and misunderstanding.
The book reminds us that within the field of psychology, the destructive effects of being raised under the influence of pathological personalities, especially those with psychopathic traits, are well recognized, often forcing the acceptance of fundamentally abnormal ways of thinking.
Absolutely. Scientific understanding within psychology acknowledges the significant and damaging impact of being raised by individuals with pathological personality traits, particularly psychopathy. This kind of upbringing can lead to the internalization of abnormal thought patterns and a distorted understanding of reality.
And diagnosis helps.
The book notes that even an approximate identification of the specific types of pathological factors involved can allow for the development of more targeted and effective psychotherapeutic approaches.
Interestingly, the book points out that even individuals who initially benefited from a change in societal system to a pathocracy, such as former victims of social injustice, will eventually begin to criticize and resist the new regime.
Yes, the book observes that even those who were initially favored or who saw some immediate benefits from the establishment of a pathocratic system, like individuals who had previously been subjected to social injustice under a prior regime, will eventually begin to recognize the inherent flaws and oppressive nature of the new system.
And become critical.
And will often become critical of it, sometimes even facing severe repercussions for expressing their dissent. The book uses the example of pre-war communists in the author's homeland, who later became vocal critics of the ruling system.
The book makes a strong argument that attempts to realize certain ideological goals, specifically mentioning the communist idea, through revolutionary means often lead to anachronistic and ultimately pathological forms that are completely incomprehensible to natural, healthy worldviews. It suggests that evolution is a faster and less tragic path to progress.
Yes, the book posits that radical attempts to implement ideological ideals through violent revolutionary upheaval often result in distorted and harmful societal structures that are fundamentally incompatible with natural human psychology and healthy social development.
So evolution is better.
It argues that a more gradual and evolutionary approach to societal change is ultimately faster, more effective, and avoids the tragic complications and pathological outcomes often associated with revolutionary transformations.
One of the early realizations within the society of normal people living under pathocracy is their own intellectual and practical superiority compared to the new rulers.
That's a key observation the book makes. Despite the initial shock and disruption caused by the imposition of pathocratic rule, the psychologically normal segment of society soon begins to recognize its own greater intellectual capacity, problem-solving abilities, and practical skills in comparison to the new leadership.
The fascination fades.
Exactly. The initial fascination with the ruler's supposed secret knowledge or superior understanding quickly dissipates as a more accurate assessment of the often deviant reality takes hold.
The book reiterates that every psychological anomaly represents a deficiency, and the influence of psychopathy on normal individuals leads to a decline in their general intelligence, a deficit that is not compensated by the psychopath's specialized and ultimately distorted psychological knowledge.
Yes, the book emphasizes that any deviation from psychological normalcy constitutes a form of deficiency. Furthermore, the manipulative influence of psychopathic individuals on those with normal psychology can actually lead to a temporary impairment of their general intelligence and critical thinking abilities.
And the psychopath's knowledge doesn't help.
This induced deficit is not offset by the psychopath's own unique and often distorted understanding of psychology, which ultimately loses its power as normal individuals gain a clearer understanding of these pathological dynamics. The book concludes that in terms of genuine skill, talent, and overall competence, the world of psychologically normal individuals is ultimately dominant.
The author shares a personal anecdote about a potentially threatening encounter with a pathocratic official that later resolved in a more respectful interaction, prompting reflections on the absurdity of the situation and a questioning of divine order.
Yeah, the author recounts a personal experience involving a tense encounter with a secret police captain, followed by a subsequent interaction where the official adopted a more respectful demeanor after the author responded calmly and factually.
And the reflection.
This experience led the author to reflect on the inherent irrationality and potential for abuse within such systems, even prompting a moment of questioning the underlying order of the universe. The author also notes their awareness that a significant number of secret police officials in such regimes eventually end up in psychiatric hospitals, suffering from a specific occupational disease linked to the constant violation of natural human feelings and conscience.
The book highlights how cognitive processes, psychological immunization, and adaptation allow for the development of new and stronger interpersonal and societal links within the society of normal people under pathocracy.
Yes, these inherent human capacities for understanding, resilience, and adaptation enable the formation of new and more robust connections among psychologically normal individuals living under pathocratic rule.
Stronger links.
These links can extend even into the middle ranks of the regime and often prove to be more effective for exchanging information, providing warnings, and offering mutual assistance than the connections found in more normal human systems, which may be less reliant on such deep levels of trust and solidarity born out of adversity.
The book emphasizes that the genesis of this profound interpersonal solidarity is only truly understandable when one grasps the nature of the pathological macrosocial phenomena that triggered it, along with a renewed appreciation for shared human vulnerability and resilience. It even contrasts these bonds with the more individualistic and competitive society often seen in America.
Exactly. This deep sense of mutual support and understanding arises directly from the shared experience of living under a pathological social system and a heightened recognition of their common humanity in the face of oppression. The book draws a contrast with the more individualistic nature of society in America, suggesting that the intense shared experience of pathocracy fosters a unique and powerful form of interpersonal solidarity.
The book suggests that the transformations experienced under pathocracy, including a de-emphasis on ego-driven thought, can actually enable a level of mental creativity that surpasses what is typically seen under normal conditions.
Yeah, paradoxically.
Potentially leading to significant benefits in various fields, if not suppressed by the threatened authorities. It also asserts that true human genius often arises from confronting difficult realities, not from complacent prosperity.
Yes, the intense pressures and the need for adaptation under pathocracy, including a forced reevaluation of priorities and a reduction in ego-driven thinking, can paradoxically lead to a level of mental creativity that exceeds what might be found in more comfortable and less challenging environments.
So hardship breeds creativity.
This enhanced creativity could potentially yield significant advancements in various fields if the ruling authorities didn't feel threatened by independent thought. The book argues that true human genius is often sparked by confronting and overcoming difficult realities, rather than emerging from a state of lazy prosperity. It also notes that established ways of thinking in free countries can begin to appear somewhat backward and naive when viewed from the perspective of those who have navigated the complexities of a pathocratic reality.
The book also discusses generational differences and how people respond to pathocracy, with older generations often drawing on their experiences in more normal societies to develop coping mechanisms, while younger generations raised entirely under the system might experience a narrowing of their worldview and a rigidification of their personalities.
That's a key observation. Older generations who are raised in countries with more normal social and political conditions tend to draw on their past experiences to develop strategies for coping with pathocracy and often enrich their understanding of the situation.
But the younger ones,
Younger generations, however, who have only known life under the pathocratic system, may experience a narrowing of their worldview, a less flexible personality structure, and a pervasive feeling of intellectual and emotional void, even while consciously rejecting the regime's propaganda.
why the void?
They may struggle to access or fully grasp valuable information due to the system's limitations and their own ingrained apperceptive filters, leading to a sense of internal emptiness. The book also notes the persistence of certain falsehoods and a kind of cognitive materialism in their thinking, stemming from the mind's natural difficulty in actively disproving every unsupported suggestion.
The book asserts that neurosis is not necessarily a sign of individual weakness, but rather a natural and even healthy response of normal individuals and societies subjected to the pervasive influence of pathological domination.
Yes, the book reframes the concept of neurosis in this context, arguing that it's a natural and understandable reaction of psychologically normal individuals and societies to the unnatural and oppressive conditions of pathological domination.
So everyone feels it.
In a pathocratic state, the book suggests that almost every psychologically normal person exhibits a chronic state of neurosis that is kept under a degree of rational control, with the intensity of this internal conflict varying depending on the individual's intelligence and their specific circumstances.
And traditional therapy doesn't work.
The book also points out the limitations of Western-trained psychologists in effectively treating such patients without a deep understanding of the specific societal and political factors causing their distress. It describes the special operational techniques needed by psychologists in such countries to help patients partially liberate their instincts and feelings while avoiding the dangers of excessive freedom of reaction within an oppressive environment.
How do they communicate?
It emphasizes careful and elusive communication due to the risks of openly discussing the system's pathology, all aimed at fostering greater experiential freedom and better decision-making within the constraints of the system.
Ultimately, the book suggests that popularizing an awareness of this pathological phenomenon in affected countries would significantly reinforce psychological resistance and provide new and more effective self-defense mechanisms for normal societies.
Yes, the book concludes that a widespread understanding of the nature and dynamics of pathocracy within affected populations would be a powerful tool for strengthening psychological resistance and equipping normal individuals with new and more effective strategies for self-defense against its insidious influence.
However, the book raises a critical question. Would any pathocratic empire ever risk allowing such widespread awareness to take hold? It suggests that pathocracy has a fundamental self-preservation instinct that would likely lead it to actively suppress such understanding.
Yeah, the book poses a crucial point about the inherent self-preservation drive of pathocratic systems.
Yeah.
It questions whether any such regime would willingly allow the spread of an understanding that so fundamentally undermines its legitimacy and control.
So they'd fight it.
It argues that pathocracy views this kind of psychological awareness as a direct threat to its very existence, a to be or not to be situation, and will therefore proactively and skillfully work to prevent its dissemination, both internally through censorship and propaganda, and externally through various forms of influence and control.
And they have an advantage.
The book also notes pathocracy's strategic advantage in often possessing a specific, albeit twisted, psychological understanding of psychopathic individuals, reinforced by distorted academic knowledge, which it can leverage for its own preventive measures.
The book describes how pathocratic systems often exert a particularly insidious form of control over scientific and cultural organizations, especially the psychological sciences.
Yes, the book details how pathocratic regimes typically assign the supervision of key scientific and cultural institutions to a special, often covert, nameless office, largely staffed by relatively intelligent individuals exhibiting psychopathic traits.
And these people get rewarded.
These individuals, despite potentially lacking exceptional talent in their respective fields, are often rewarded with academic degrees and prestigious positions. They're even used to represent their country abroad, sometimes being conspicuously exempt from routine party activities to create an illusion of nonpartisanship. Crucially, the book notes that these individuals are generally known within the society of normal people for who and what they are.
And psychology is especially targeted.
The control over psychological sciences is described as particularly malicious and treacherous. The book explains the existence of both officially written and tacitly understood lists of forbidden topics and directives to distort other subjects, effectively reducing psychology to a hollow shell.
What about training?
Psychiatric training is often deliberately inadequate, allowing mediocre physicians to become psychiatrists after only brief courses. This opens the field to those willing to serve the authorities and leads to a significant decline in the level of mental health care, creating opportunities for the political abuse of psychiatry.
The book even provides a somewhat surprising example of seemingly pro-regime propaganda that inadvertently contains well-reasoned scientific information, hinting at potential internal contradictions or ideological disorientation within these systems.
Yes, the book offers an intriguing example of a publication that outwardly appeared to be in line with the regime's ideology, but surprisingly contained a well-articulated summary of Western research supporting the role of heredity in various traits. This suggests a potential ideological disorientation, or perhaps even a degree of independent thinking among the editors involved, highlighting the inherent contradictions and occasional slippages that can occur even within tightly controlled information environments.
The book also touches on the significant difficulties in obtaining necessary scientific data under pathocratic regimes due to censorship and a general lack of understanding or appreciation for rigorous scientific inquiry.
Exactly. Access to essential scientific data is severely hampered under pathocracy due to pervasive censorship and a fundamental lack of understanding or value placed on objective scientific inquiry by the ruling authorities.
So people try to get around it.
The book describes how dedicated students and new specialists often resort to trying to access stolen scientific information, and it emphasizes how this absence of proper scientific awareness leads to a worrying degradation of scientific standards and progress within these societies.
The book reiterates the fundamental need to understand the inherent conflict between the very nature of pathocratic systems and the principles of genuine psychological and psychopathological science in order to fully grasp the reasons behind the government's often bizarre and counterproductive behavior.
Yes, the book concludes that a deep understanding of the fundamental incompatibility between the core tenets of pathocracy and the objective investigation of psychological and psychopathological phenomena is absolutely essential for comprehending the often irrational and self-defeating actions and policies of pathocratic governments.
The book suggests that the practical knowledge and the inherent psychological resilience developed within the society of normal people living under pathocracy can even have a positive influence on established religious denominations within those societies,
Yeah, it's an interesting idea.
potentially helping them to overcome historical ponerogenic infections or influences.
That's an interesting proposition. The book suggests that the lived experiences and the strengthened psychological understanding within the society of normal people can act as a corrective force within religious institutions that may have been historically susceptible to ponerogenic influences.
So,
It argues that while philosophical and moral reflections alone might face psychological barriers in addressing these historical infections, the stark reality of pathocratic rule can paradoxically lead to the infusion of specific antibodies of understanding that help to cure these long-standing issues.
the book draws an analogy to the limitations of traditional medicine in dealing with certain diseases, suggesting that overcoming pathocracy requires new approaches based on understanding its fundamental nature and causes, much like modern medicine evolved to address previously incurable illnesses.
Yes, the book draws a parallel between the limitations of traditional medical practices in the past and the current inadequacy of purely political or ideological approaches to dealing with pathocracy. Just as overcoming certain diseases required the development of a deeper scientific understanding of their essence and causes, leading to the emergence of modern medicine,
Right.
so too does overcoming pathocracy necessitate a new approach rooted in a thorough understanding of its underlying nature and origins. The book notes that gaining this understanding is often more challenging and even more dangerous than simply implementing therapeutic actions. But it asserts that the very act of understanding itself can begin to heal the psychological wounds inflicted by pathocracy.
The book underscores the well-known limitations of efforts that are based solely on moral appeals when dealing with powerful and deeply entrenched systems. It compares relying solely on force to using a straitjacket, suggesting that its use should diminish as our understanding and skills in addressing the underlying issues improve. It advocates for measures that reach all people and nations, addressing the root causes of these societal diseases, not just pathocracy in isolation. It explains that evil exists on a spectrum, where one type can often lead to another, regardless of the specific ideology involved.
Right. The book emphasizes that relying solely on moral condemnation has historically proven ineffective against deeply rooted systemic issues like pathocracy. While force might be a necessary tool in certain limited circumstances, it's a blunt instrument. True progress lies in developing a comprehensive understanding that can be disseminated widely, addressing the fundamental causes of these societal pathologies that extend beyond just one specific form of oppressive rule. And it stresses that harmful tendencies exist on a continuum. One type of societal dysfunction can easily pave the way for another, regardless of the specific ideological label attached to it.
The book explains that psychotherapeutic work conducted under pathocratic regimes often includes a significant instructional component, providing patients with objective data and analysis to help them reconstruct their personalities and develop a more realistic understanding of the world around them.
Yes, therapy in this context often goes beyond traditional emotional support and involves actively educating patients about the nature of the pathological system they are living under. Providing them with objective information and analytical tools helps them to deconstruct the distorted realities they have been forced to accept and to rebuild their own personalities and worldviews on a more accurate and healthy foundation.
The ultimate goal, according to the book, is to help the world regain its capacity for healthy common sense and to reintegrate worldviews that are based on scientifically objectified and widely understood data. This, it argues, would lead to more sensible, practical activity, greater independence and resourcefulness, and a stronger sense of safety and well-being. It frames this as a standard task for good psychotherapists, with the primary challenge being the need for global dissemination of this understanding.
Yes, the overarching aim is essentially to restore a global capacity for sound judgment and to promote worldviews that are firmly grounded in scientifically validated and widely accessible information. This, the book contends, would naturally lead to more rational and effective actions, greater individual and collective self-reliance, and a more pervasive sense of security and well-being. It's presented as the fundamental task of effective psychotherapy applied on a societal scale, with the main hurdle being the need to disseminate this critical understanding across the globe.
The book predicts that the strongest resistance to these ideas will likely come from those who have been the most vocal in their condemnation of pathocracy, using purely moralistic interpretations and focusing solely on its current ideological label.
Yeah, that seems plausible.
It suggests that forcing them to confront a more complex, psychologically informed understanding will be difficult, as they would have to acknowledge that their previous efforts might have inadvertently served the very goals they opposed. The book even advises against directly confronting their past aggressions, especially with older individuals who might be less receptive to such fundamental shifts in perspective.
That's a very insightful prediction, I think. The book anticipates significant resistance from those who have most vehemently opposed pathocracy, using a primarily moralistic lens and focusing exclusively on its prevailing ideology. It suggests that asking them to adopt a more nuanced, psychologically informed understanding of the phenomena would be challenging, as it would require them to confront the possibility that their previous, perhaps simplistic approach may have inadvertently played into the hands of the system they were fighting against. The book even advises a degree of caution in engaging with them directly, particularly older individuals who might be less open to such fundamental reevaluations.
The book also briefly considers the potential impact of this kind of widespread enlightenment on the pathocrats themselves,
Right.
noting the tendency in individual psychotherapy to avoid directly confronting patients with permanent hereditary conditions while still using that understanding to inform therapeutic strategies. It suggests a similar cautious approach on a macrosocial scale, acknowledging that some degree of confrontation might be unavoidable but should be grounded in scientific understanding rather than moralistic condemnation, with the overall well-being of society as the paramount concern.
Yes, the book touches on the complex question of how increased understanding might affect individuals within pathocratic systems. Drawing a parallel to ethical considerations in individual psychotherapy, where therapists often avoid directly confronting patients with the idea of permanent inherited conditions while still factoring that knowledge into their treatment plans, the book suggests a similarly nuanced approach on a societal level.
So not purely confrontational.
While some degree of direct confrontation with pathocrats might be necessary and even morally justified in the pursuit of peace and societal healing, it should ideally be based on an acceptance of underlying biological and psychological realities, without resorting to purely moralistic condemnation. The overarching principle must remain the well-being and safety of the broader society.
The book anticipates a positive response from those who have direct lived experience of pathocracy, but potential opposition from political emigres who might be clinging to older, more experiential methods of analysis.
That seems likely.
It suggests making persuasive efforts towards them while also preparing solutions that align with contemporary biohumanistic sciences, even though those fields might currently be underdeveloped in this specific application. The book notes the undervaluing of such scientific studies by conservative societies and suggests using this information to expedite necessary legal and societal updates.
That's a likely scenario, yeah. The book anticipates a generally positive reception from those who have firsthand experience of living under pathocratic rule, as they will likely recognize the validity of the analysis. However, it also predicts potential resistance from political emigres who may be more invested in traditional, often vengeful approaches.
So what's the recommendation?
The book recommends making efforts to persuade them through reasoned arguments, while simultaneously developing solutions grounded in contemporary biohumanistic scientific understanding, even if those fields need further development in this specific area. It also notes a tendency in more conservative societies to undervalue such scientific studies and suggests leveraging this information to accelerate necessary updates in legal frameworks and social policies.
The book emphasizes the importance of caution in our terminology, advising against using names that have become too closely associated with the infection of pathocracy, and instead favoring historically traditional names that predate its emergence.
Right, linguistic hygiene is important.
It uses the example of pre-Marxist utopian socialism as potentially being more realistic than later movements that were significantly influenced by pathological material.
Yes, the book stresses the need for careful and deliberate language, advising against the use of terms that have become heavily contaminated by their association with the historical manifestations of pathocracy. Instead, it recommends a return to more traditional and historically rooted names that predate the onset of this infection. The example of pre-Marxist utopian socialism being potentially more grounded in reality than later socialist movements that were significantly shaped by pathological influences illustrates this point about the importance of careful terminology in our analysis.
The book reiterates that natural common sense alone is insufficient for retrospectively refining ideological values that have been deformed by large-scale pathological processes, emphasizing the indispensable role of psychological objectivity, knowledge of psychopathology, and the specific insights offered by the book itself.
Exactly. The book concludes that while natural intuition and common sense are valuable tools, they are ultimately inadequate for the complex task of correcting ideological distortions that have been introduced and amplified by widespread pathological social processes. Achieving this requires a deliberate application of psychological objectivity, a solid understanding of psychopathology, and the specific framework and data presented in the book itself.
Given the lack of historical precedent for the kind of societal transformation that is needed, the book suggests relying on modern science and being guided by imaginings of a society's free and healthy development, rather than being overly constrained by outdated historical data from potentially compromised systems. It notes the loss of a generation's worth of potential evolutionary progress under pathocracy.
Yes, recognizing that there is no precise historical blueprint for the kind of societal healing and transformation required, the book advocates for a reliance on the principles of modern science and the power of envisioning a society's natural and healthy trajectory of development as if the period of pathological influence had never occurred.
So look forward, not just back.
It cautions against being overly bound by historical data from potentially corrupted systems and highlights the significant setback represented by the lost evolutionary potential of a generation that lived under pathocratic rule.
Finally, the book proposes a vision of a superior system called logocracy, which would be based on a deep understanding of the natural laws operating within individuals and societies, with objective knowledge progressively taking precedence over opinions based on natural but potentially biased responses.
Right.
It suggests that logocratic systems could offer a greater guarantee of long-term social and international order, and would have the capacity to evolve into even more perfect forms over time.
Logocracy, as envisioned by the book, represents a more advanced form of societal organization that prioritizes a thorough understanding of the natural psychological and social laws governing human behavior. In this system, objective knowledge and evidence would progressively supersede opinions based on subjective biases or emotional responses.
And the potential.
The book suggests that such a system holds the potential to establish a more enduring social and international order and to facilitate ongoing positive evolution towards more just and harmonious societal structures.
So the key takeaway from this deep dive, really, is the crucial role of understanding human psychology and psychopathology in analyzing the origins and manifestations of harmful actions and societal structures. It provides a framework that goes beyond simple moral or theological explanations.
Exactly. Recognizing these underlying psychological factors can offer you, the listener, a more nuanced and, frankly, potentially empowering perspective on the complex events you encounter in the world around you.
And for you, the listener, maybe consider how the concepts we've explored today might apply to current events and the challenges facing societies right now. What assumptions might you need to question when viewing these issues through this ponerological lens? It's certainly a lot to think about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.